sorry. I'm watching Panda Bear World on Instagram. That's what's good, man.
Wow, that sounded like Ashley.
It was Ashley. I was going
Oh.
through my Instagram. I guess she just posted a video of some shit.
Oof, long day at work.
Okay. Well, that makes one of us. I had a very easy day today. I cannot complain. What was so hard about your day, Frank? Fill the people in on your cross that you must carry. Oh, kill me. How you been, man?
It all comes down to the fucking Christians.
Doesn't it always?
They fuck this whole thing up. They fuck this whole thing up. Jesus wasn't a Christian. Just let that marinate for a moment.
Yes, Jesus was a Jew, right?
And he was a Jew.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. How you feeling, Frank?
I'll just leave it there. I'll just leave it there. So, Prince, as we come to the end of our season, and I think after this episode, there's one episode left of season 1. One of the things that I really want to play with next season, and some great ideas, is, and you'll understand as we talk about the album that we're going to do today, this idea that if you pull a string on one artist or one producer, then you start to navigate the wealth of music that became the 80s. I think it's absolutely incredible.
That's a good point.
And before we because I know we ain't gonna do this on our last episode, because I think the other one will be back, right? So I know we're not going to get into this on our last episode, but I think that we have to have some honorable mention to conversations that we didn't have and conversations that we will have. Let's just take a moment and let's talk about why we don't talk about Bruce Springsteen, and why we don't talk about Prince, and why we don't talk about Michael Jackson. I think that's incredibly important.
Explain that to the people.
One, there are people who are more talented, more in the know, more credentials, get paid more, have a better quality product than we do to talk about those guys.
Yeah, that's a long list. And it's a lot of people. You're right.
Just putting it out there. So that being said, you're never going to hear anyone talk about Culture Club the way we talk about Culture Club. Or
you're probably right.
And apparently you'll never hear anyone talk about Keith Sweat, because nobody will ever see that episode.
The lost episode.
The lost episode, right? Bonus material for the first 1,000 subscribers, right?
Exactly.
The lost Keith Sweat episode, right? But that's the reason that we don't talk about those guys. But there are a whole bunch of guys. When I think about what season 2 and what season 3, the things that we'll get to talk about, I'm looking really forward to talking about Roxy Music. I'm looking forward to talking about the Pet Shop Boys. I'm looking forward to talking about In Excess. I'm looking forward to talking about Men at Work. I'm looking forward to talking about ABC, and I'm looking forward to talking about Lionel Richie, right? I'm looking forward to talking about all of these artists that were absolutely substantial in the 80s that you just can't get to in 10 episodes, although I think we did a great job. One of the people who I also look forward to talking about, and he's come up no less than 2 times on this podcast, is Adam Ant.
You're right. Yes.
Adam Ant.
Yeah.
You can't talk about the 80s without talking about Adam Ant. And so
yeah.
I think we have to talk about Adam Ant. And we have to talk about, we talked about Culture Club and how Adam Ant was so influential in just spinning off iterations of where we
Right.
go. And it's interesting because the album that we're talking about today is no less connected. So Chris Hughes was the drummer and the keyboardist and the electrical guitarist of Adam and the Ants, and he actually was the producer and the writers for Kings of the Wild Frontier. He was also producing the writer for Stand and Deliver, right? That whole
Right.
thing. So really cool. And his name is Chris Hughes. And it just turns out that Chris Hughes doing what a lot of folks did back then was Chris Hughes became a producer, and he produced the first album from this duo, Tears for Fears. He produced the first album called The Hunting or The Hurting,
I,
The
yeah, the
Hurting,
hurting. The
The
hurting.
Hurting, right? I saw the
Yes.
this little weird dyslexia that just finishes off letters, right? And the Hurting is an amazing album, but it was not consequential, and it wasn't. You have to understand, it wasn't consequential in the time of Let's Dance and big spectacles, and it wasn't
Mhm.
certainly not Rio by Duran Duran, and not um, Culture Club, Kissing to Be Clever, and all the rest of this stuff. It
Right.
just wasn't that song. As a matter of fact, it was rather unremarkable outside of the context of who Tears for Fears would become. Right?
Right. Was there any hits on that first album? I'm trying to.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, there was, and I'll pull it up real fast because the hurting was and the hurting was an amazing album in that it introduced us to what's her name, the singer, you can reach me by aeroplane,
Mm.
right, that one,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right,
Hmm.
because they discovered her, right. So the hurt Mad World, Pale
Yes, Mad
Shelter,
Girl. That's the
and
yeah,
Pale
that's the song.
Shelter. You give me cold hands, you give me pale shelter,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you don't even know. Right, that was great,
Yeah.
And
And
when you
Mad
go
World
through,
became a big,
huge,
a hit
huge.
later on. Right.
It what's interesting is that Tears for Fears was much like groups like Midnight Oil, Beds Burning, right, or The
Hmm.
Alarm, right,
Hmm.
or kind of where Big Country kind of flattened out at. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Just
Hmm.
really like, wow, they have that really good song that is a call to arms, but it's a little pretentious, you know?
Yes, yes, yes. But
And
that's
that was it.
because they were, the whole band seems to be built on trying to get their psychological issues fixed. That seems to be the whole,
Absolutely.
what
Absolutely.
they're about.
But then something interesting happens. And by the way, Chris Hughes from Adamant, just closing that
Yeah.
loop, he ends up um, being brought in as the last minute as the producer on Songs from the Big Chair
Mm.
by Tears for Fears, and he changes the entire landscape of it. Um, but again, as we talk about pulling the thread of people who bring certain things, we we did I think an amazing podcast on Big Bam Boom by Hall and Oates, and Big
Yes.
Bam Boom, it was engineered and produced Bob Clearmountain, and that's why you got
That's right.
those big giant drums. Well, it just so happens that Bob Clearmountain did the engineering and some of the productions for Songs for the Big Chair, and that's why
Right.
you have those big drums, those big spacious drums. And also that brings in this idea of sampling into Songs of the Big Chair that make it sound remarkably fresh, even though it's an
Right.
album that came out in 85, I believe. Yep, in
Yeah,
85.
85. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it makes it sound remarkably fresh. I tend to think of Songs from the Big Chair has the album that closed the 80s. So if you think about Songs from the Big Chair, and by the way, it's interesting, right? And be careful what I'm saying. I'm saying is that
Okay.
in the 1980s were two decades, right? It was, 81, because it didn't really start in 80,
Hmm.
81 through 85, and ended with Tears for Fears. And there were little bits and pieces like Bad Disco from 1979, right? Wang Chung is a band that comes to mind, right? Have
Yeah.
fun tonight.
Right.
That's
Right.
when you knew it was really over, right? That's when you knew that, holy shit, I'm the last guy at the party. Fuck, they turned on the lights, right? That's Wang Chung's, right?
Right. Yes.
That's Wang
Yes.
Chung's,
The
right?
music has changed, and I didn't realize it. Okay. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
Right.
And but it was even worse because right about 1986, even the most um, new wave of bands like Duran Duran, they come back with Notorious in '86, totally change their sound, much more mature, much more sophisticated. You've got David Bowie, who's black with like Blue Jean, which is totally, you know, totally a different vibe because
Right.
we thought that the only thing we knew about David Bowie was Let's Dance and Smooth and the Blonde Ambition tour, or
Right.
the Blonde Ambition was Madonna, but it was the Serious Moonlight tour, right,
Yeah.
by David Bowie, right? That was the name of it.
And he dated a black chick. That's what I
And
knew.
he married a black chick.
Yeah, he ended up marrying her. Right.
He married a badass black chick.
As well, he should. Why not?
Listen
You're
to
gonna-
all you white people listen to the podcast. That's an ally.
Oh.
That's an ally, right? If you want to do something with your life, don't vote for Cory Booker. Go marry a black woman. See what that does. I tell you, it just never ends. Um, but so now you have, and then the rest of the '80s, you start to get into this whole phenomenon of Bobby Brown, and we went into that, right? Where Bobby
Right.
Brown in '86 and '87, and New Edition in '80, all of a sudden turned music on its ear, right? Because '86 we have Keith Sweat, and we have Johnny Kemp just got paid. We have Albie Shore coming in 1987, which is but we don't think of those bands as the '80s, right? We don't think of Albie
Right.
Shore as an '80s artist. We think of Albie Shore as a '90s artist because what they did was so generational that it pulls over into the '90s.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, that's usually how that works. The decade doesn't really end when when time-wise, it takes time for everything to catch up.
Right,
Yeah.
and sometimes it ends. So when you say '80s and you say an '80s podcast, typically you're talking about any place from maybe '78, right? Blondie and the Clash, and those things that you can't Kraftwerk, and those things that you can't quite, Gary Newman, Cars, right?
Right. Yeah.
Those things that you can't look past.
Right.
But
Because
but
it
may
ended
not
up
have happened.
influencing the music
Exactly.
of the time.
Exactly. But then you don't want to get into Wang Chung because I don't want to have that conversation, right?
There will
And-
be no Wang Chung podcast.
Exactly. And then conversations about Father MC, right? And treat them like they want to be treated, and conversations like around Heavy D and the Boys and those types of things. Probably not conversations that we have on this podcast, but I think we would because we did talk about Bobby Brown, and again, if you subscribe early enough, you can hear us talk about Keith Sweat. So that being said, the end of the '80s, and I think the perfect bookmark to the '80s was Songs from the Big Chair, and Songs from the Big Chair, full stop. It's an album that got the sound right, the lyrics right, the production right, the image correct, and the sequencing, which you guys know I care about, incredibly right. It is a satisfying album to listen on repeat. Let's not forget that about this time, our Sony Walkmans had auto reverse. So when you're on the subway, and you had that, I
Right.
almost said iPod. You had that Walkman in your pocket. Boy, when that tape auto reversed, I was the shit. I was the man. Listen, I had endless music as
You
long as
felt
I can
like
get
the
those.
future.
As long as I can get those AA Duracells, my nigga, you know what I'm saying? And then I can get the AA Duracells from the Chinese spot, which were Duracells but doorbells.
Were they really Duracells? Let's be honest.
They were doorbells, right? Didn't matter, nigga. I can get two for $2. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And that's a lot. And that was also a time that New York City instituted the 5-cent bottling reclaim. So don't think, my nigga, that all of us that were too chicken shit to sell crack in the 80s, we was walking around with bags, clear bags, to bring them back to the poor bodega guy that you go like, here are 600 pissy smelling bottles that I picked up on the side of the road, on the side of the BQE from truck drivers pissing in and throwing on the side, throwing the piss on the side. I poured out the piss, by the way, and I'm just gonna put this back in.
Batteries,
right? And I bought 2 AA batteries for all of that. Free, baby, free, right? that was the 80s, right?
Man.
Because I was too chicken shit to sell crack with Nas in them. So that was the beauty of it. Songs from the Big Chair. We're talking about today. Tears for Fears, 1985.
Classic.
I think it's important to understand that your remarks at the top of this podcast about these guys that were the kind of kids that said, well, they were the kind of kids in the neighborhood that their parents knew that they had no friends, so they said, "Here are gloves for your friends. Here are bats, and here's the ball. Go down to the playground and go make some friends." And the moment that someone tripped them, they took their balls, bats, and everything. They even took the bases, and they went home. And that's these guys. Songs from the Big Chair was created for the intent of saying fuck you to the English press because they had gotten shitted on at being nameless, not substantial. By the way, how the fuck can you have a political message and not be U2 in the 80s? You know what I'm saying? I mean,
Right.
fuck. Sammy Hagar went the entire way and started singing about aliens. You know what I mean? So, right. Let's talk either Hot for Teacher or Sunday Bloody Sunday. You know, it's one of those things where, and then you have Tears for Fears, which is sitting in the middle, and then just like, it's a mad world, and that was it just wasn't substantial, and it was pretentious. And it wasn't that they didn't feel that way. It's just that it was pretentious to just keep telling people how you felt.
Well, the album was based on. This reminds me of. There's something about these British bands. The Police, when they did Synchronicity about what's his name?
Carl Jung's book.
Carl Jung's book. And these guys, their album was based on the Primal Scream guy.
Stephen King and the movie Sybil. And Sybil's got psychosis, and she only feels comfortable when she's sitting in this oversized
in the big chair, right?
Yes,
and that's where it comes from, right?
Right. As opposed to having a movie based on the villain in a campy sci-fi movie called Barbarella, Duran Duran,
right?
Or let's have a band that's put together because we all have different cultures. Let's make it Culture Club, or even best. George Papadopoulos doesn't quite ring out as well as my middle name, George Michael, right?
I think I think that's just that's just something English bands have a bad habit of being pretentious.
By the way,
that's part of their DNA.
Robert Brown, or Bobby Brown's real name is Bobby Brown, and I think Keith Sweat's real name is Keith Sweat.
It's Keith Sweat, probably.
Right.
Of course.
That tells you something, right? By the way, looking at Bossip, as I am prone to do, or looking at Bossip on Instagram, as I'm prone to do. Did you hear about the woman who graduated with a PhD and her name was Marijuana
Pepsi? Two of my favorite things.
Pepsi.
Yes, Dr. Marijuana Pepsi.
Dr. Marijuana Pepsi.
Gotta love it. You know?
It's, and by the way, that black woman in this world overcame everything and got her PhD, and all she'll be remembered for is her ratchet ass parents. Because that's the only reason that
parents thinking.
Well,
what was happening there?
And
I didn't read the article. I just read it.
And by the way, Dr. Pepsi,
right?
I love it, right? Or Dr. Marijuana, if you know her, right? Is now going to be famous just for her name and not any of her accomplishments, because the Bossip article failed to mention what she's a PhD in.
Right? Oh my God! Oh,
which is classic, right?
Oh.
Which is classic.
Sometimes my people really disappoint me.
Right. I'll just leave it.
But everybody disappoints me.
Prince. That's Prince.
But that's a personal issue.
Oh boy, I can't wait until our sometimes co-host comes in on the set of her new show next week, and because we'll have as much fun talking about that couch as we have talking
Right.
about a whole
Yes,
bunch of other
yes.
things.
Speaking of songs from the big chair.
Right,
Right.
exactly. So songs from the big chair. So one, let's just start off the album, and let's start off the album and make it the first single. Let's take both shotguns. Let's open it up, right? And let's just take a well, it doesn't have that ding 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 ding, right?
Right.
It doesn't have that. But let's, by the way, shameless plug for Apple. This podcast is brought to you by the Apple Pencil, the $99 thing that you can buy to write on your iPad because fuck you, your fingers aren't good enough. Apple Pencil. Subscribe now and you'll get a discount. Go to apple.com/adult education for your 95% off discount.
Wow.
Yeah, it's 95% off. Just go to that website.
Right.
Okay, so sorry about that. Shout, amazing song. Both barrels, you know, it's a song that really doesn't mean anything, and it's supposed to be an anthem, but it's so incredibly pretentious. Shout,
Yes.
shout, let it all out. These are the
Right.
things that I'm talking
I can
about.
do
Come
without,
on,
right.
I can do without. Come on, I'm talking to you. Come on. And
Yeah.
and you know what? That is the weakest. Like somebody sitting there and saying, "Just say shout." It is the worst attempt at songwriting that I've seen, but it works. And the only reason that it works is because at that time we were dealing with so much synthesis, but we were also getting street music. And Bob Clearmountain drums, man, that sounds like a sample, you know. Do, do,
Right.
do, do, do. Do, 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 you know, and that's what
Right.
we heard, right? And that is what made the song magical. Shout, great song. In violent times, you shouldn't have to, right? Great use of delays, great use of. But if this is the first time you're hearing Tears for Fears, you're just like, okay, like
Well, I
this is
think
cool, but okay.
I mean, to mention, I like how you brought up Bob Clear Mountain and that whole sound that he brought to it. Because I mean, as you said, this was a very pretentious band. They're singing about the song "Shout." It was all based on the whole Primal Scream book and all this stuff about letting your anger out and all this stuff. This is why kids won't have nightmares if they scream during the day. It's bizarre, but white people shit. But I didn't mean. But the whole
They don't know, like they don't. White people just don't know to just swallow that pain of your uncle
Exactly.
doing whatever he's doing to you, and then go on and then just move on.
right,
Right, because
right,
be glad that your uncle is the one that took it from you, and not the guy that is the nephew of your babysitter that came over after your parents left.
I think what made this album and this song so good is because even though it was very pretentious and most people had no idea what the fuck they were singing about or
Right.
talking about, but it had these cool ass drums that sounded very very street, very very cool, and it just added a whole aura of wow, something's big is happening here.
Right.
That's what, yeah.
Right. It makes as much sense as you're out of touch, you're out of
Right.
time, but I'm out of my head when you're not around. All right? Shout, shout.
Right.
But you're right. And this is one of those cases where, ladies and gentlemen, and spending as much time in music as Prince and I do, especially in the making of music, new album coming soon, what you realize is, what you start to realize is that your lyrics are reflective of who you are. The
Right.
music that you make is reflective of everything that's going on around you at the time.
Exactly.
And in many cases your music is just reflective of holy shit, I heard this great sound with a reverse echo and it's you know what I'm saying? Oh fuck, I'm gonna
Right.
make a whole fucking song around that. You know what I'm saying? And then you
Right.
write lyrics about something. Well, I am reading I am trying to I'm trying to fuck this girl, so I'm reading a new book by some doctor on
Right.
self,
Hmm.
on transcendental meditation and how you need to
Right.
get your mind right and center yourself and everything. So you know what? I'm just gonna write a song about that because it'll make me seem deep, but fuck, I get to
I get
hit
to
that
use that
sample.
sound. Right.
You know what I'm saying? And by the
Yeah.
way, real quick side note, um, three songs that were just a sample that ended up being a song that shouldn't have been a song. Any examples? Go. It Takes Two. Wah! Uh, wah! Uh, wah! Right? Prince,
Oh.
you, right?
All
Right?
right. Caught me by
Uh,
surprise with that one. All right.
Unbelievable, right? Unbelievable. Whoa!
Right.
Whoa! Right? Whoa! That's right. Song, absolute album that shouldn't have been a song. That somebody just said, "Yo, this sample is just this sample is just so fucking dope."
That guy, by the way, was a very good songwriter. I forget his name. The
There you go.
unbelievable guy, by the way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go. I
I'm just saying. I'm just saying. I'm just putting that out there for prosperity's sake.
right,
He
right.
was a good songwriter.
Listen, dance on your knees, 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 knees. Bam, chicka, bam, chicka, 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 bam, chicka, chicka, bam. Right? So it's perfect examples, right? And by the way, well,
And then
by the way,
yeah.
three songs that weren't meant to be songs, but they really did really well in car commercials. Go to the greatest hits by Phil Collins,
Ah.
right? In the air, and I remember. Wow, that effect is dope.
Oh.
Let's write a whole song about that shit. You know what I'm saying? So, okay. Um, this is, by the way,
I got to put Phil Collins on the list. He's an '80s guy, right?
he's
Is he?
that. Well, okay.
Mm.
He's an '80s guy with Genesis and Mike and the Mechanics. Not Mike and the Mechanics, but yeah, Genesis. He's also an '80s guy with everything that he did. But I give him credit because um, when he did that song "Easy Lover," it was like, oh, that's the guy that be singing the high lines in Earth, Wind and Fire. Oh, what's his
Right.
name? What's his
Exactly.
name? Philip Bailey, right? And that's just how you feel,
Yes.
right? He brought the world back to Philip Bailey. Although the Commodores did have that one hit Night Shift without Lionel Richie, but I digress, right? Let's go back to
All
songs
right. We'll
from the
save it for
Big
the
Jam.
drummer episode. Famous drummer
Exactly.
episode. Right.
So we have Shout, and that's amazing. So we have this big opening to a song, and then we have The Working Hour. And The Working Hour is actually one of the better songs on the album because it's well written.
Yeah.
It's well produced. It's very slick. It's got a message. It's got that repetitiveness, but the repetitiveness is, that find out what this,
Hmm.
right, and it shows chops, and I think that works great. But it's got to be a standover from the hurting.
Right. Yeah.
Because it doesn't
Yes.
go
Yeah.
with the rest of the album, right?
Hmm.
It
That's
doesn't have the Bob Clear Mountain big drums and big production and all the space and everything else like that. So that's The Working Hour, and I think The Working Hour works as a song. I don't think it's a 6 minute and 31 minute song, 6 minutes and 31 second song, but yeah.
Tears for Fears always gives you the impression that they have something to say, even though no one really knows what it is. They, that's their modus operandi.
Right,
You know.
because
Yeah.
it wasn't like my dad was coming on home from work and drinking a pint and just saying, "Find out what the." My dad wasn't doing that.
Right.
Nobody's dad was doing that, right? What
Right.
they were doing was, I just writing, and when you write from a position where you really don't have any skin in the game. By the way, this segment of the podcast brought to you by Dasani Water. Dasani Water, the drink of champions.
That's right.
Dasani works really well because once you finish the water, you fill it up with vodka, and it does wonders for your liver.
Continue.
That's the Working Hour by Tears for Fears, and I agree with you. It's pretentiousness at its best. I don't think it belongs on this album, but it's not a bad second song. It is a little
Yeah.
bit too anticlimactic coming down from Shout because Shout it's a gym song. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
I'm working out, I'm doing that, but then I'm coming back and it's like the working hour just doesn't give me. It doesn't give me. It's like, oh, okay, so you gonna get my dick hard, ready for this to do that, but then you giving me nothing.
Hmm.
You gonna lay there like a starfish, right? I'm not going into my personal problems, but you understand what I'm saying, right?
Hmm.
Um, then it brings us to the song that didn't make it, right? And this is how you know Tears for Fears is pretentious, because every pretentious artist has the story that says, well, we needed another song for the album, and I heard these two chords that Roland was playing, and I thought it was great, and we just wrote something, and we thought it was light, and we didn't think it meant anything, but Chris thought it was great, and it would break in America because for some reason, even though we speak in an English accent, we have to sing in American so that people will accept us. And even
Right.
though we don't call ourselves pretentious, we really feel the need for strange acceptance by 300 million people who don't even know anything about us, right?
Right.
And so what did I do? I recorded the song that was light, airy, that really didn't mean anything, and I filmed it in the Midwest, and basically in a small town off of the desert, to just really just talk about absolutely nothing, and then include some byproducts of an era, the Temptations, and no, doing that. Everybody wants to rule the world, or the song has it was originally written as everybody wants to go to war, and they
Right.
thought that that was too contrite and boring, so they said everybody wants to rule the world. Which, interestingly enough, you got to remember this album came out in '85, so that song was probably written beginning of '85, '84.
Hmm.
But everybody wants to rule the world is the quintessential bookmark of the '80s.
80s,
It
exactly.
describes the
Yes,
'80s to a T, right?
exactly.
if if
Hmm.
if 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 our podcast wasn't focused on talking about the 80s from the perspective of grown folks, which is why we call it adult education, it would definitely be the Everybody Wants to Rule the World podcast,
Right,
right?
exactly.
As we talk about the 80s, right? Because
Right.
in the 80s, guess what? Everybody fucking wanted to rule the world,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
that was at that.
Everything
Listen,
was
that,
excess. Everybody was out for everything. Everyone wanted
exactly.
everything. Right.
Exactly. Remember, crack was nothing but a way that black people can enjoy cocaine.
Right.
You got to
Hmm.
look at the upside on everything, Prince. You got to look at the upside on everything. So, um, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, again, was a throwaway song that became a smash hit.
Right.
Ridiculous. Smash hit. This is the single that just drove the album through the roof.
Right.
And it's not particularly an interesting song. I think it is as light and as boring as everything else. But I think it had a catchy hook,
Right.
and if you played it enough on radio, and at that time you can't dismiss the beauty of payola at that time. You know what I mean? And if you played something enough on the radio, you can break through. And let's face it,
But let
by the time you got to 1985, you had a choice. You were listening to "I Want Your Sex," or you're listening to "Everybody Wants to Rule the World."
I will say this though, to give them credit. At that time, that there was nothing that sounded sounded like that song. I mean, that song was very.
Fair enough.
It was a very original sound and all this. And I mean, obviously, it's one of those songs that made their. I mean, it made their career. It's. I mean, they're
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
living off the royalties of that
Yeah.
freaking song. They're
Right,
touring
because y'all,
now.
yep, because your fucking people will be in Twitter if they did a concert and didn't play that song.
Oh,
Your motherfuckers would be in Twitter, boy.
right,
You would just be in like hashtag fuck, fuck Tears
right,
for Fears.
right.
Right?
Hashtag fuck Tears for Fears.
Right,
Right.
exactly, exactly. Oh my god, I hope that doesn't start trending. But if it did, please, please
But
blame other podcasts. Don't come
they're. I
bring
mean,
it back
they're
on
on
us.
tour.
Yeah.
It's funny because they're on tour now with Daryl Hall and John Oates.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes. Yeah.
and
I
you
have
know,
tickets to their
I
show,
wonder if,
and yeah.
if Bob cleared them out and put them together.
You know, so famous duos. I do have tickets to their show. Um, Tears for Fears ends up being an interesting story because one guy leaves the band, they keep the name Tears for Fears, and then he
Right.
comes back and says, "Okay, I can't make any money without you," right? And then they
Right.
go on tour, and so I'm going to see Daryl Hall, John Oates, and Tears for Fears, and I'm also going to see Hillsborough County's Biggest Pig at the Florida State Festival as it's coming. as it's-
Oh, you are so fucking mean.
You're out of
Uh,
touch. I'm out of time.
we're talking about Tears for Fears. Okay,
Is,
yeah. So
is
that
there a
was a
possibility that all four of them can get on the stage and we could be like, "I'm sorry, who are you, Duran Duran?" Right? Play Rio.
oh,
So there,
oh
so
my
there you go.
goodness.
No, everybody wants to rule the world. Smash hit puts them on the map, and it's interesting because what they thought that everybody was going to do is they thought that everybody was going to say, "See, we're big. See, we've made it." And all that anybody really did was say, "Oh wow, you put out a really light song that's just really pretentious, and you're still pretentious." And they took it as, "Well, we have acceptance." And
Hmm.
you know, artists, and I'm speaking very honestly here. There's a point in your artistry that you don't want to be accepted, and I think that that's when you're at its best. As a child of the '80s, and you're a child of the '80s, we tend to be men of a certain age, and as we are men of a certain age, it becomes very, very clear that why, Frank, why are you trying to put out music, and why are we trying to do a podcast? Because we're men of a certain age,
We
and
don't
we
give a
don't give
fuck.
a fuck, right? That's the key. That's the key, right? And that's when people want to pay attention, not when we are being contrived and let's do a podcast about topical events. I
Okay.
had that conversation, so uh,
Right.
that's a side conversation. Um, so everybody wants to rule the world is a song that you have to listen to, not just when you listen to the best of Tears for Fears, but you have to listen to Everybody Rules the World if you're going to have any conversation about the '80s. As a matter of fact, that starts off the montage, right?
And let's be honest, everyone has already heard it. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly, exactly,
That's a
exactly.
song that even today everyone has
E-
heard it. They can't.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's one of those songs.
It's just played everywhere. It continues to be played everywhere, and it's not going to get people off the ground, right? But nobody
No.
changes the station when it comes on, and
Exactly.
that's the key,
Right.
right? And that's
Right.
a great song. So let's get into Mother's Talk, right? Mother's Talk was really interesting because Mother's Talk was a song that was built after the Hurting but before Songs from the Big Chair. So there are different versions of it, right?
Hmm.
And what was interesting about Mother's Talk is that they actually recorded one version of it, and then they were performing it live, and then they threw it away.
Ah.
And
Okay.
then they recorded Songs from the Big Chair, and they took out Mother's Talk, and they had Chris Hughes did it, and that's the version that we have, right?
Okay.
Which is great. It's a great way after Everybody Wants to Rule the World, right? And then you have that, right? And it's very much Bob Clearmountain.
Right. Yeah.
We can, right? And it's very hip hopish, right?
Right.
It's very Hall and Oates, and it works, and it's big, and it's loud, and it serves as a counterbalance on the first side of the album to shout, right?
Right.
And then having
Yeah.
Everybody Wants to Rule the World instantly, that first side of this album is a hit.
Yeah. Definitely.
The
Most
first the
definitely.
first side of this album makes this album worthwhile to buy, and I think that that's incredibly important. So Mother's Talk was much like Careless Whisper by George Michael, a song that gets recorded and then thrown away because it wasn't done quite right, bought back and have someone else interpret it. Boys and
Hmm.
girls, that's what a producer does. A producer will take your music and not just necessarily create new music, but take your interpretation and bring out the best in you, bring out your performance, and arrange it and bring it in such a way that it's palatable. And
Right.
two different producers are going to take the same song and do two different things, right? That's the power of a producer, right? So I understand we give Michael Jackson a lot of credit, but you better start fucking talking about Quincy Jones
Exactly. Right.
because Billie Jean and Beat It ain't Billie Jean and Beat It without Quincy, right?
We don't talk about Michael Jackson on this podcast. I'm sorry.
Problem is, not enough people talk about Michael Jackson.
Uh,
But if we were a podcast of two 26, 30-year-old white guys that have dancing, dancing shows that failed, we can do an HBO documentary and get paid very, very handsomely if we talk about Michael Jackson.
um,
He touched me.
I am not going to get involved in that conversation.
But can you describe what his penis was like? Was it filling? Was it filling?
The man owned a monkey. That's all I have to say. That's I think that basically defines Michael Jackson to me.
Prior to 1865, a lot of men owned monkeys. So a lot of
and I'm sure
it's
Bubbles
Ju-
is now living his best life.
it's
I just hope-
Juneteenth. It's Juneteenth, and we made
Right.
a comment about the man owned a monkey, and prior to 1865, a lot of people owned monkeys. Wow.
You said that. I did not say that. That's why I went back to talk about Bubbles and living his best life.
A lot of motherfuckers are going to vote for Joe Biden. You know that, right?
What choice do they have?
One white guy for another white guy.
I had to talk my dad off the rails, off the ledge this week because he was, he called me up complaining about Trump. He just is like, this country is done. It's done. It's over. Why this week it clicked, but it's just like
Donald Trump is the greatest gift to black people because it finally made white people understand what the fuck we've been living with. Because I have never seen in the history of America, and in all my years of being on this planet, I have never seen white people say, "Can we get treated any worse?" And black people go,
really?
Yo, motherfuckers don't want to listen. It ain't too bad. It ain't changed. They still
Exactly.
beating the fuck out of us, except they beating the fuck out of you too.
Right.
White people.
Oh, well.
Okay, I believe, right?
Yes.
I believe starts the second side
I
of
choose.
songs from the big chair. More vodka for you there, Prince? Okay, there you go. God forbid, because you're on the liver transplant list, and you're slamming back. Fucking okay. I believe is a it's an interesting start for the second side of the album, and one of the things about I believe that I think are important that I think is important is in the sequencing of an album. We've now just jumped a shark. 85. We've started the conversation about CDs. And we've started the conversation that there are no sides.
Right.
Like I was telling you about, we have auto reverse and we have all those things, right? So I believe is not the first song of the second side, but it's merely just a continuation of a long first side. And that's how we consumed it, right? That's how
Right.
we consumed it. So I believe is I believe is what George Michael's "One More Try" was. One More Try, just a nice jazz ballad, just to prove that we can do it, and singing in the falsetto, and it was not Roland Orzabal, but Kurt Smith is the other
Right.
singer, and it was his opportunity to shine because apparently Roland was coming up with a lot of the ideas, a lot of the music, and I'm not going to discount what Kurt brought to the table. What I'm going to say is that when he left Tears for Fears, they were the same band, basically. Just going to put that out there.
Yeah, they were the same band, but they kind of weren't the same band. If you listen to the music.
Hold on, I'm just getting an update email. Let me open it up. Oh, my Tears for Fears and Hall & Oates tickets. The lineup has changed. It's Roland Orzabal from Tears for Fears and Daryl Hall. I'm still going.
You're still going?
I'm still going. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna get the hits. I'm gonna go. No hashtag fuck Hall and Oates. Fuck Tears for Fears on this one. I'm going. I'm going. I'm good with that. I'm good with that. So that's the 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 I Believe, and I Believe is just that song. It's just a song to showcase. It's got some interesting samples of women screaming in the background, and
Yeah.
it's very muted. Doo, 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 doo. It's got a little melody, right? But it's a little. It's I Believe is interesting.
Like
But
all of
it's
their
the
songs,
simple.
it
Yeah.
sounded important, even though it didn't really say anything.
Well, it sounded important because it was almost as if, look, I have a song that I sing too,
Right? Yeah.
right? Because in all the music videos, this poor guy, Kurt Smith, he's singing behind a microphone stand. And every other shot, the other dude is on the guitar. He's on the keys. This motherfucker's this
Right.
motherfucker, he's doing
He's
it all.
working.
He
God
fucking
damn
got
it.
the saxophone. He's doing it all, right? The other guy's just standing behind a mic, just prudent and prodding, and right. And the other dude is sitting there. You can tell the dude that do all the work because. Look at the video for Sarah Smile, and you see Daryl Hall, and he's in the control room pushing the faders. Right, the other dude is just behind a mic, just putting that out there. Right,
Right.
just still I can
Ugh.
still continually shit on episodes later. Right,
Right, man. That
that's classic.
episode is over and done.
Right, episodes later. So that's I Believe. I Believe is I think I Believe again. It's a song. It's a filler that works,
Yeah.
but it's a high end filler.
Mm.
Right. It's
Yeah.
not a filler like side B of Culture Club's Color by Numbers. Right.
Hmm.
It's a
Yeah.
it's a high filler. Then we get into Broken, and the interesting thing you can't talk about Broken without talking about Head Over Heels, and then the
Right.
the rest of Broken. Right.
Hmm.
Um, very one just if you buy Tears for Fears has this band that's in the studio that's just doing layer after layer, take after take, it was the attempt to make them feel like, whoa, this is a live experience. These guys are all jamming and everything else like that. No, girls and boys. They just take the sound of an audience, and if you could hear it, you could hear it looped over, and they put enough reverb on it, right? That makes it sound
Mm.
like it's on a stage. So you're getting this live song and live song experience, which ends up giving the band credibility. But
Right.
no, it was cut in the studio with sound effects,
Yeah.
which
It's like the laugh. It's like the laugh tracks you hear in our podcast. Right.
we're gonna have laugh traps in our podcast.
Of course we do.
Hold on, Travis. I'm gonna drink this. You make that.
Oh.
I just gave you room, Travis. I just gave you room. um,
Right.
Travis is our producer, folks. So
Right.
just
Yes.
letting you know.
Exactly.
Okay. So Broken just serves that purpose. It gives the band credibility. It makes the band
Yeah.
seem
Right.
bigger than life. It makes the band seem big.
Hmm.
Head Over Heels.
Another
Amazing,
classic.
amazing. Yeah,
Yes. Hmm.
everybody knows the riff, and unlike everything else on this album, you actually feel like these guys sat down and actually wrote a song. That it wasn't some sampled, "Hey, this sounds good," and what can I do with that loop? It was just like, "Yo, listen to this riff that I wrote, and it
Yeah.
works,
Yeah.
and it
It's a
works,
great
and
song.
it's a great song, and." It's a song and it has emotion and it's got a sense of desperation and so often we hear in 85 we're hearing songs about politics, we're hearing songs about not being in love anymore, we're hearing songs about people just beefing and everything else like that. It's great to hear a song about something happens and I'm head over heels. You
Right.
know what I'm saying?
Mm.
And for a teenager at that time, I hadn't moved out of my parents' house, but as a teenager at this time, there were about two or three women that I knew that I was in love with. I would spend the rest of my life with,
Hmm.
because statistically, meeting the woman I was going to spend the rest of my life with, two doors down in the housing projects in New York, was quite a reality. No, um, but it brought that back and it gave me something and it was the soundtrack of certainly numerous relationships that I had, and it worked.
I don't think that song though would have been as successful if it didn't come behind the other songs that they had done, because I think people already had an impression of this band as being very pretentious, very, save the world kind of, well, not really save the world, but like, in angst guys. And I think this song is like, it had the feel of like a love song feel. And
Right.
like, oh, okay. Oh, all right.
Right.
I can relate to these guys even more now,
It
I,
earns Tears for Fears another spot on a different mixtape
exactly. Yeah.
that I'm doing. Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. And by the way, that's the value of A&R back in the day, where you're
Yeah.
really just picking the sequence of singles to
Hmm.
come out. You
Right.
don't go big. You go Shout, and hopefully Shout picks up. And Shout picked up enough that everybody was willing to listen to the album. Everybody Wants to Rule the World just brings it home, and then
Hmm.
Head Over the Heels is just a song that just it makes sense. It feels
Right.
good. It is a perfect third song of a third single. By this time, your album sold 2-3 million copies,
Right.
and
Right.
so it just works well. And then, then they released Mother's Talk, and that was just kind of like, well, what else can I go and get? It
One of
it,
the
it, it ended up being one of a song that just drove the B side. It drove because at this time we were
right.
buying 12 inches, and so you got a whole different song or a whole remix on the other side.
One of the interesting things about this band that I don't think we mentioned is that this is one of those bands which didn't really have a genre of fans. It was something that basically, it was like they were like a band from like the 40s or the 50s before there were genres. It's
Right,
just like everybody could listen to their music.
right.
It didn't really fit into any particular category. It was soulful enough for black folks. It was, it
Exactly.
was
Yeah.
it
Good
just
point.
fit all over the place. Mothers, it wasn't offensive, so that your parents could listen to it. Everybody could get behind Tears for Fears, basically because nobody knew what the fuck they were about. That's
By the way, as I listened to this album in prep for this, as I listened to this album again in prep for this call, I could have swore I heard "We the Best" DJ Khaled, because that's another artist that goes for everybody.
right.
Nobody knows what they stand for. They don't really have a genre, and it's just music for music, and it's incredibly
Right.
contrived, right? So Tears for Fears is the DJ Khaled of
Of the
of
1980s,
the
right?
1980s. Yeah, you can't talk about the 80s just like you can't talk about the what do we call the 2019s, the 20s, the 2020s, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
can't
right.
talk about this decade without talking about DJ Khaled, the way you can't talk about the 80s without talking about Tears for Fears, yet you don't know what he added.
Right. Yes. But
Right?
he was important. Everybody heard him.
Right.
You
He
know that.
sold a lot of albums.
Right.
Apparently not enough to get the number one spot. Okay, so
Uh,
we just got a whole bunch of haters.
right. Right. You
Yo,
think he'll make a
Khaled,
video? Think he'll make a video about us saying something bad?
right, Khaled's gonna drive up from Tampa, drive up from Miami to Tampa. He's gonna put his foot in my ass. We the best.
I love his video with with the people walking outside, his security running outside the car. I just love that. I just think that's such a great visual image. It's ridiculous.
I I I love the fact that he feels secure enough that no one's gonna try to kidnap his kid. That he just shows his kid everywhere. Just I I love my
Do you
son.
really think somebody would kidnap college kid? No.
Ask
Don't
Jay
care.
Z and why Jay Z has. Well, that's
But
horrible.
because that's Jay Z.
Right.
DJ Khaled, really? DJ Khaled's kid?
Yeah,
Really?
all of Jay Z's albums went to number one.
Right, right. Yeah, I can see the headline line. Number 2 album. Guy's kid kidnapped. uh,
But they didn't count the energy drink giveaways. Okay.
Energy drinks. Yeah, that. Yes, energy supplements. to sell albums. Ugh. But that's a whole different podcast, a whole different deal, man.
Oh, finally, we end up with Listen, and Listen again, I think is a better attempt at, I believe, in creating just a mellow, melancholy. Um, yeah, it is the vitamin B12 that you take after taking ecstasy all night. It
Yeah.
just replaces your serotonin, and that's what Listen. And Listen is a very good, and Listen is the perfect song that it's very light, and it just has enough vibes, right? That finally, when you're just wiping away the coke snot and you're just mellowing, right? Some of
Yeah.
us do, right?
Mm.
It is the cigarette after sex, right? Um, it is the slobbing on your pillow after sex if you get to be a man of a certain age. But it is the just it's the
Yeah,
mellow,
the cigarette
right?
after sex. When I used
Right,
to smoke, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When I used to have sex, shit. Okay, so that is what Listen is, and Listen ends the album, I think, perfectly. And it's the classic, even with Michael Jackson and Madonna and Bruce Springsteen and even Prince. It is the end of Purple Rain that makes you turn it over and listen to Let's Go Crazy. You
Hmm.
take Listen and then you flip it over and you go back in the Shout and it brings you back up again. So it is the perfect, it is the perfect roller coaster that lets you off close enough to the lines that you're willing to get back online again.
I think another thing that made this album so good is that it was short. Not that you
Fair
know.
enough. Yeah, fair enough.
The reason I say that is because this band comes across as very pretentious. But they by keeping the album and the whole thing, I think it was only like what 8 songs on the whole album,
Yeah, it
8 or 9
was
songs. Yeah, 8 or 9.
9 songs. Yeah,
Yeah,
and by the way, one of those songs was 2 minutes and 38 seconds. So
right. You're right. Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
it's just,
There's,
I just, yeah, I'm gonna leave
but
that like that.
I think it's in, like you said in the beginning of the podcast, you cannot talk about the 80s and not mention this album, not mention these songs. I mean, these songs they're still played today.
That's right.
Everybody knows. Yeah.
That's right. And every 80s and 90s station, absolutely. And it's
Right.
a song that, if I come into a store and I hear Everybody Wants to Rule the World or Shout, I never really hear Head Over Heels because I don't know that it's aged that
Yeah,
well.
I don't.
But
Yeah,
if I
yeah,
hear
that,
Shout and I hear, especially if I hear Everybody Wants to Rule the World, I instantly know what type of dynamic they're going for, what audience. I even know what Sirius
Right.
XM radio station, 80s at 8,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And by the way, shameless plug for Sirius to come pick up this podcast. It can be yours. Our
I don't
our
think Sirius
subscribers.
does podcasts.
Sirius owns Pandora right now.
I know,
And
dude.
Pandora has podcasts. Pandora's got the Questlove podcast, which is
I
really good. Really, really good.
I never listened to Pandora except I started listening to it because on Sirius there's a Pandora channel that
Yes.
plays nothing but the best songs on Pandora. And I was listening to that and I'm like, man, this is nothing but fucking hits. I love this.
Right,
You
right.
know, I'm like,
It's
maybe I should cancel this and start listening to free Pandora. But I
It depends,
didn't,
right?
because I
Because
started
if
listening.
Sirius picks us up, then we are listening to Sirius. If Spotify picks us up, fuck Tidal, fuck Apple, right? Unless Apple picks us up and gives us a headphone deal, right?
I love
gives us
Tidal,
a-
and
yeah.
I wouldn't mind being on Tidal. I like
Well,
Tidal.
not if Jay-Z's going to sell it. I don't want to.
Um,
If he gives us a rock, okay. Everybody Wants to Rule the World is that perfect song, and that is the story of Songs from the Big Chair. The Everybody Wants to Rule the World and the bookmark of the end of the '80s, which surprisingly came in 1985. And by the way, I remember the '80s. I remember the '80s real well. And about 1985, I was tired. I'm fucking
yeah,
tired.
pretty much everybody.
Yeah,
was.
I'm fucking tired by right. And I think what did Clinton get elected in '88? So we were moving into Clinton. No, Bush got elected in '88. So we're moving out of the Reagan. Reagan was on his second term, and we were
Right,
moving
right.
into a different world. I think the
We're
The
getting ready
wall
for
was
Madonna to get big. We're getting ready
well,
for
Madonna. Well, Madonna was already big in '84, right, with "Like a Virgin." But we're ready.
yeah, but that
We're
was
getting ready for Madonna to transform.
right. Yeah.
By the way, by the way, I took a pill and I was transform. Um, I was transported to my 17-year-old self. Right. That's how
Okay.
Madonna's album begins. That's the album you told me to listen to, and then it's got a Portuguese rapper
Exactly.
who's at the beginning of the album saying, like Diddy, yeah, yeah, like he getting ready to spit some bars, and he's Cuba Traba, right, right. That's what he's doing, right? Which takes me some. Okay, that's horrible
I
because I
told you
just
that.
butchered.
I told you that album
Obrigado,
was very
right,
good.
right. Um, songs from the book chair. I'm gonna give it a thumbs up. Must listen to it for the Tears for Fears catalog, and you must listen to it for '80s. Thumbs
I'm
up.
gonna give it. I'm gonna give it this way because I think you basically already heard it. That's what I think. I think everyone has already heard it. It's
Right.
a quintessential album.
That's
You
fair
don't really
enough.
need to listen to it. You've already heard it.
Don't rush out to buy something you've already heard, or you're gonna hear the best parts of
Right.
on Spotify, which I do hope picks up the podcast. So, songs from the big chair, Tears for Fears. Prince, any final words before we end this one?
Um, I don't. No. I was gonna tell a story, but no, I'll pass. Never mind. I don't
Tears
have
for
a good Tears for Fears story.
Songs from the Big Chair was an important album for me because it came at a time in my life that I was surrounded by the most horrific of images and I needed something to. That's pretentious. No,
Right.
it was good, and I was able to put it on different mixtapes, and the songs started well and ended well and were long enough for me to get lost and drown out my father's badgering and the gunshots coming from the projects at night.
I
That's what
think
it was
it's a.
for.
I think it's amazing that these songs are still as popular as they are. That they've managed to stay popular for so long,
Right.
and they are more popular than the band. I mean, the band never reached the heights of their songs. Their songs are more
That's right.
popular, way
That's
more
right.
popular
That's
than them.
right. Right. Right.
Nobody can name members of that band. Nobody can name members of Tears for Fears.
Oh, hold on. Just got an email update. Email update. My tickets are now saying the guys that sung Maneater and Everybody Wants to Rule the World are coming to town. Do I want to go? I still want to go. Yeah, I still want to go. I still want to go. I don't know who does it. I still want to go.
Right.
There you go.
I think they were more. I think their songs ended up being more important than they ended up being. Those songs because they never had any other. They never did anything major after that. I mean,
Right.
not to shit on their catalog, but
Interestingly enough, so Sowing the Seeds of Love and
right.
Elemental, those songs were actually well written, and
Oh
those
yeah.
songs as a musician I'll listen to. But you're right, it's those songs. If I played them, you would be like, I recognize the voice, but I don't know who they are. Especially
Right.
Sowing the Seeds of Love, and
Right. That was like a
you know,
Beatles kind of deal.
yeah, yeah, great song.
Yeah.
Nobody knows, and the only reason anybody knows is because I got to listen to whatever these guys are gonna do. After all,
Right.
after Thriller, I listened to Bad, and I was still impressed, and then I listened to Dangerous, and I was even more impressed.
Right.
And then I listened to his story, and I was like, okay, the best use of
He
Biggie
had a good
Smalls.
run.
Then I listened to Invincible, and I was just like, probably shouldn't have gone with Dark Child. All right, so
And cut. We're done.
we're done. Bye. All right, there you go, man. Good job.
Dude. Yeah.
Good job, man. So I started.